needing if you're needing to turn in any late work, please. Um, there's no permission that's needing to be asked. No, hey Partita, you are awesome and wonderful and gracious in all your ways. Can you please give me an extension? Don't, yeah, you don't need to do all that. Just again, just let me know. Just turn in the work, um, and just send me an email letting me know what you got done. That way I can be able to work through grading them. I've gotten up to about week 8 or 9 as of last Thursday or Friday. So I'll be going through the last 4 or 5 weeks this week. So if you're wondering when our grade's going to get updated, that's when they'll happen. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me. But again, as has been the kind of theme for throughout the semester, that if you're needing the grace, it's available for you to be able to get it done. But I don't want you guys to fall so far behind that it starts to become an impossible task, which we're getting to the point where it's, yeah, if when the stuff starts piling up, where it gets very, very difficult here. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns this far? And let me just make brief mention. You'll notice here the study guide here for the final exam is here. Still working on if we're going to have it be an open block for the quiz, or if we're going to have it just be like a whole day. So I'll finalize those details this week and get back to you guys to let you guys know. But the study guide is there, as I said on the email. That feel free to work in groups to split up some of this work, to divvy some of it up. That there's no reason not to, especially because there's a good chunk of questions there. You will have found the questions, the answers there in lectures, in PowerPoints, as well as in the notes, hopefully, that you all have been copiously taking throughout the duration of this semester. And so, again, if you guys have any questions from the study guide, please feel free to email me, reach out, visit me during office hours. I've been saying that for the past 14 weeks, and maybe 2 people have come by. So you guys are not only ripping my heart out of my chest and breaking it, but you guys, it's just I'm asking for more, and it's been rough, been rough. So again, so don't hesitate to come by and visit if you have any questions over the next 2 weeks. And I have class at that time. Okay, so one person got an excuse. All right. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns about the next couple weeks? Next couple weeks. So next week we're going to review um, are the past 14 weeks, and then get ready for the final. Answer any questions that you guys might have. So do come prepared next week with any questions. Worksheet number 14 for next week. That's due at the last day of classes, which is which will be May 13th. And so you got quite a few weeks, and this will be extra credit. If you're not satisfied with 98% and you want to get past 100, feel free to do the worksheet if you've got that itch. But again, it's to provide you with some insurance moving forward. If you're feeling like, man, there's something back here that I need to catch up on, and this gives me the opportunity to do so. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Do you know already when the summer spiritual gifts class will happen? I do not know. They keep delaying when we're going to be getting the contract and stuff. So I'll have to take a look. It should be up on, I'll have to take a look, but it might be up on Empower, the dates for it. But as of yet, nothing's been finalized per se. So yeah, I wish I could see more because that's coming up in like 2 months. But yeah. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns, doubts, fears? Things that you remember at 3 in the morning to forget to ask about. All right. Well, if there's nobody that has any questions, let me go ahead and drop this down. Let's go ahead and jump into lecture for this afternoon. It'll be a little bit of a different kind of feel, especially for the second half, because you're going to be working more in groups. But today, what we're going to be doing, a little bit of review, more specifically, looking at, you know what, I forgot to include this portion of what I wanted to talk about, especially with the 3 sermons. Let me go ahead and add that real quick. Um, believe this one should be it. There we go. I had mentioned the layout for Exodus being, or Deuteronomy being 3 sermons, but didn't necessarily fully explain where the partitions were at. And I wanted to be able to lay that out for you all pretty clearly. Um, and so I want to do, go, let me go ahead and do that now. Um, okay. And then another thing I had wanted to make mention of specifically was, okay, I'll come back to it after break then. Um, so in talking about Deuteronomy, what I had mentioned last week with the layout for Deuteronomy was talking about the emphasis, especially last Monday, the second half of class, the emphasis on how the demonstration of love as covenant obedience, the demonstration of love as covenant obedience, and how Israel doesn't just live out their faith purely in cognitive terms and what they believe, but rather in the actions in which they perform as they settle into the land. I had mentioned last class about how, and I'll talk about this at the second half of class because I need to find the slide for it. Um, how Deuteronomy is laid out as a suzerain vassal treaty, an ancient Near Eastern treaty generally, but more specifically as a suzerain vassal treaty. And I'll outline some of those elements at the second half of class and talk about why that's important. But just to briefly mention about that, the reason why it's worth bringing up is because that it gives us a specific context into which Deuteronomy can be read. That read in a vacuum, we can do lots of really weird things with Deuteronomy that was not the intention. And even going back to Leviticus, when we take it out of context from being a covenantal relationship with Israel, and very specifically addressing issues for Israel, then we can come up with a lot of weird things which can happen. And I'll talk about this more next week as we're wrapping things up, more specifically with blessings and curses. And that some of the things that can happen is that we can, and has already happened, is turn certain texts into generalized kind of platitudes. And some of the things I'm thinking are both related. I'm sorry about that. Let me turn this off real quick. Um, Let me see. Where is this? Do not. That's not going to work. Okay. There we go. All right. But even more specifically, when we take a look at Deuteronomy, um, of looking at it within its context, of being able to see some of the things that have been not just taken out of context, um, but that by removing the nature of suzerain vassal treaties, one of the things we come upon is removing the obligation that Israel has to perform once they enter into the promised land. Sorry, the dang phone call threw me off. Um, but that being said, one of the things I do want to, I had mentioned last week about how Deuteronomy is a series of speeches or sermons, and those are where the breaks are at. You have this phrase that these are the words that Moses spoke. This is the law that Moses set before the Israelites. And then this last sermon, these are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites. And so that's where we have the 3 sermons. And you will see this on your final of one of the structures and some of the specific elements to a suzerain vassal treaty, which again, I'll talk about in the second half of class for today. But yeah, those are where the breaks are at. And again, it's really important for us to identify part of the structure here in order to identify the rules that the text is playing by. And we'll see why in a little bit, especially as it relates to Israel's cultic and legal life or civic life, especially as it relates to the 10 words. And so one of the things that I had mentioned last week of what we were going to go through was some of the similarities and differences from Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And that's going to be important to note because, again, it may or may not appear on a study guide here of some of the main differences. What are the significant differences? What does this change about the law? And what this might say about the nature of God's relationship with his people. And so these kinds of questions I want to keep in mind, especially as we talk about how we do theology, how we understand the text, and how the nature of the commands given to Israel doesn't change, but the reasons for their remembrance does. And I want us to critically think about, let me adjust this a little bit. I want for us to critically think about what significance those changes have in the way we think about how do we live today as God's people in a context that is radically different, not just from 20 years ago, but from 2,000 years ago, from 2,500 years ago, from 3,000 years ago? And how do we make sense of our place in the world as God's people? And how do we make sense of this story? How do we make sense of our identity in light of what God's done and who we are? And so one of the things I want for us to pay attention to, we were going to do this exercise of taking a look at Exodus 5, Exodus 20, and then Deuteronomy 5, but it was going to take a bit of time and I want for us to focus elsewhere. So I'm going to focus us on one specific section of the text. And what it has to do with is this command to keep Sabbath. But do note some of the difference here again, and to consider as we're reading through this, what changes and what this might say about the nature of God's relationship with his people. What changes and what does this say about the nature of God's relationship with his people? Exodus 20, that to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So at least here, what's the reason for observing Sabbath? Out of Exodus specifically, what's the reason for observing Sabbath?
Because God did it.
He did it. But what's the story that's informing? That's a good reason. What's the story that's informing this reason to keep the Sabbath? What story that came before the Exodus event?
Oh, the creation story?
Hey, there you go. Creation. That Exodus is pulling on because Yahweh is creator. He created heaven and earth, all that is in them, and then rests on the seventh day. That there's a certain narrative that Exodus is drawing from in order to make its point. And so when we read Deuteronomy again, it's important for us to see some of these differences. And so Deuteronomy 5, that observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so again, what story, what narrative is Deuteronomy drawing from?
Obviously the deliverance of them from the Egyptians, but isn't that just like a reminder of he's saying, oh, he did this for you, so don't forget about why we keep the Sabbath holy because of the creation story?
And that's part of what we need to wrestle with, is that obviously the difference doesn't happen in the command. They're told to observe the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath. And so what we need to wrestle with a little bit are the connections, because in Deuteronomy 5, you don't have the calling back to creation. You have, hey, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. So Deuteronomy is doing something very specific that we need to talk about and see, why do these changes happen within its context. And again, within a context of a suzerain vassal treaty, to see not only some of the commands, that these are the commands that Israel is obligated to keep as an expectation of living out their loyalty or devotion. And so again, that the basis in Exodus is creation, but in Deuteronomy that relies on this Exodus narrative, that again, both of them are telling, hey, look at what the Lord's done. But again, here in Exodus, it's all about creation. Here in Deuteronomy, it's all about the Exodus. But we need to ask the question, why? And what does this change in Israel's relationship? And so the biggest differences between the two, when you read through Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, these two seemingly parallel renderings of the same passage, the same set of words, the same rules, the same regulations for Israel's daily life. What's the difference? Sabbath. And we need to ask, of all things, why Sabbath? Why wasn't there a change to emphasize even more? Because Israel seems to have an idolatry problem. Why not just blow that up? Make a bigger emphasis on idolatry. Yeah, they say you're not going to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Yeah, you're not going to have any other idols before the Lord. You're not going to worship anybody else. But why not elaborate more on that part instead of Sabbath? Why not elaborate more on treating your neighbors better? Because Israel's going to start to have real issues as they enter in the land with that. So what is it about Sabbath that gets elaborated on even more that demands for us to take a little bit of a look at it? Again, emphasis for Exodus is going to be the creation account, and Deuteronomy emphasizes the Exodus event, which again reveals to us Deuteronomy's concern for an ethic that is based on the Exodus and the revealing of God's character through it. That this Exodus event reveals who God is, who is Yahweh, this relational deliverer, that question that Pharaoh has, the question that Moses asked, the question that the people have about who is Yahweh is revealed through the Exodus event. And so Deuteronomy's ethics, the way in which people ought to live, ought to worship, ought to behave and act towards one another is guided, informed by this event. And so again, that there will be a merging between the two in Deuteronomy, between again, who Israel understands Yahweh to be and how they are to live in the world. That Israel's been chosen from among the nations as a sign of God's faithfulness to humanity. Therefore, Deuteronomy will redefine this in terms of God's purposes for the world, rather than their size or even their righteousness. And so again, it's through Israel's ethics that these divine purposes for the world were going to be achieved through Israel's obedience, not through their size, not through their power, not through their ability to keep Torah, or their own righteousness, again, their kind of own moral standing with God, but rather in living in this kind of covenant faithfulness or obedience, that emphasis starts to get heightened. So Sabbath in Israel. The connection between Sabbath and the Exodus emphasizes this kind of act of remembering through embodied practices. And what I mean by that is that it was through the Sabbath that the people specifically remembered and reenacted, celebrated this event of what God has done in delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. Yes, they participate with God in resting and doing what he does after 6 days of creation, after 6 days of laboring. But also what they do is that they get to reenact and to remember Yahweh's work of delivering them from the hand of Pharaoh, the one who demanded not only loyalty, but also demanded work every single day without a single break. So Israel has a God who tells them, take 1 day a week off. And mind you, everyone gets a Sabbath. Everybody Sabbaths. Slaves, male and female slaves, servants, animals, the land, everything and everyone gets to Sabbath, not just those who can economically afford to do so. And this is really, really important, because in the ancient Near East, you have other people that have kind of similar kind of things with Sabbath, but it was usually the economically well off that were able to take a Sabbath, but those who were slaves and those who were not, or who were economically disadvantaged, had to work. And the sad thing is that the same proves true today. That the command to keep Sabbath is one for those that have the economic stability to be able to do so, because a lot of our families, friends, maybe even ourselves, are not in the position to be able to take a day off. And living in Southern California does not make that any easier. And so it's one of the ways in which what Sabbath, the intention of Sabbath, what it's meant to reinforce, you have those five there. And this is taken from Walter Brueggemann, that it provides Israel with this distinctive kind of memory. The Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, singularly chose Israel and delivered them from the hand of Israel, which works in conjunction, again, with that public act of identity, of reinforcing that the people of God have this opportunity, this privilege to be able to celebrate and commemorate this divine action of what Yahweh has done for his people of all the earth. God's chosen this people to be able to work through and to preserve and to deliver. That it serves as an act of resistance. Again, working actively counter culturally against the systems that look a whole lot like Pharaoh, the demand that our lives are oriented around production, our lives are oriented around work specifically, that you are what you do and your value is conditioned on what you're able to produce. Sabbath says, no, that you're part of God's covenant people when you couldn't do a dang thing for yourself. How do you know that? Because when you were slaves down in Egypt, you couldn't do a thing for yourself. God went down with an outstretched hand and a mighty arm and delivered you from the hand of Pharaoh and brought you to himself. Not because you were any righteous, you were any stronger than anybody from the earth, but in fact, you were the weakest of all the earth. But God had set his love on your ancestors and brought you to himself. It has made you a royal priesthood, a nation of kings and priests, queens and priestesses. So again, this kind of countercultural narrative that puts the emphasis or re-emphasizes the value of an individual's humanity, not based on what they produce, but based on the way Yahweh has oriented himself in relationship with humanity as being singularly valuable because of the nature of their being human. Again, counterculture to what Pharaoh embodied and then demanded from the people. Pharaoh got paranoid, started killing babies. Yahweh enlists the help of people who preserve life. Pharaoh demands that those who are already enslaved and burdened become more burdened to their labors in order, again, to build his own empire. What does Yahweh do? He chooses this dude, just killed an Egyptian, running like a renegade out in the desert, hanging out with some sheep, and talks him through a burning bush and says, that's my dude. And sends him and his brother. Now Moses can't speak very well. And that's his dude. And he brings them up out of the land of Egypt. So again, this act of resistance that Sabbath is meant to embody and then form as this alternative community of individuals that have been delivered and experience this act of redemption, and also an act of hope, awaiting the day when all of creation will be able to rest from their labors. That the way that the world is right now is not the way that the world that Yahweh has intended. Yes, it's still good, but yet we're still in the process of awaiting when Yahweh will come to make all things right and to renew all things. And so again, a lot of this sounds idealistic, countercultural, and in some ways, hopefully in a lot of ways, sounds very attractive. But this is what Sabbath was meant to do. And you can see why Sabbath is emphasized as this kind of ethic within Deuteronomy, because of the way in which it's meant to be performative, the way that it's meant to be embodied, to be lived out, in order to work against the narratives that often would leave people not only oppressed, but also marginalized, especially those who are economically disadvantaged. And Deuteronomy has a lot to say about those who are economically disadvantaged. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes and in the second half of class more so. But one of the things that I want for us to pay attention to, especially in Deuteronomy, but real quick before I talk about that, are there any questions, comments, concerns this far? Questions, comments, concerns? All right. So one of the things I do want to introduce in talking about, because I've made a point to talk and to express, hopefully that you guys are picking up on this, the emphasis in Deuteronomy on Israel's ethic life, that what they do in their everyday, the way that they live, the way that they orient themselves every day, and how they treat people, how they treat their neighbors, it matters. Matters so much so that they have this whole book that tells them everything from how they treat their neighbors to what they do to their land, but also included within these same portions, interwoven, and hopefully you picked up on this, is that the narratives go back and forth between Israel's worship life, what they do to celebrate and remember what God's done together in their worship and their feasts, and also what they do in their civic life. Again, how do they treat their neighbors? And so I'm going to read this portion of Deuteronomy 16 and then unpack some of this here. That it says in Deuteronomy 16 that observe the month of Abib by keeping the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. And here we have just a few verses later. You shall appoint judges and officials throughout your tribes and all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall render just decisions for the people. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality, and you must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Justice, and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant any tree as a sacred pole beside the altar that you make for the Lord your God, nor shall you set up a stone pillar, that things that the Lord your God hates. So here we have these kind of, over the course of the whole chapter, you can have like this massive sandwich. At the first part, you have these layers of talking about what these specific feasts and how they're supposed to be celebrated. But in the middle, you have this bit talking about how justice is meant to be rendered by those who are appointed judges and officials, leaders who are making decisions for the people in matters of trials, like legal trials. And this last bit about idolatry. Worship, justice, public life, and then idolatry. So again, we see these different ways in which Israel, where are we at here? Is somebody still there? Israel, their life and their systems, between their cultic system and their civil system, is interwoven together. That the Israelites are given this cultic system, also called the Mishkan, which is the place where God dwells, that tent, so they can have a relationship with God. Again, so much of what Leviticus focuses on is how do the people maintain their relationship with Yahweh when sin enters into the picture? How do we deal with the things that get in the way of relationship? And so much of what their cultic activities or the worship, their activities related to the worship and the religious life, is for the continued acknowledgement, reparation, and continuance of the relationship with God. but they're also given a civil system, mishpat in Hebrew, that justice or legal system, so that they can relate well with one another. So again, these two systems, the cultic system that manages, negotiates the relationship between God's people and himself, and the civil system so people can identify with one another, are interwoven with one another. So, but I've already kind of given the question away, but answer away, but based on the reading of Deuteronomy, is there a divide between the civil and the sacred? Is there a divide based on what we just read in Deuteronomy 16? Is there a divide here? It's not a trick question. You guys can jump in, turn your mics off, or turn your mics on. Unmute yourself.
Is that a no?
There you go. As I've already said it like 10 times, so it's not too hard to decipher, but this is really, really important, especially when we talk about, and hopefully this doesn't get anybody uncomfortable, but when we start talking about systemic issues in church, it shouldn't have us uncomfortable as much as it should have us thinking, lamenting, praying, and then working towards solutions, especially as they affect communities of faith. And this is what we'll just think small, as it affect Christian brothers and sisters that are living under unjust and oppressive conditions, including poverty, lack of educational resources, lack of economic opportunities, public transportation that sucks. And so these are just some of the few issues, even related to sexual violence, trauma, lack of mental health resources. That the portrait that Deuteronomy paints challenges the assumption that when we're in church, we don't talk about politics. Why? Because at the heart of politics, the word polis, P-O-L-I-S, you'll find it in words like Minneapolis, Minneapolis at the end. I'm trying to think of other words that have polis in the name. But what the word polis means is cities. The happenings of a city, and what politics deals with is what happens in cities. But what are cities filled with? People. So when we talk about politics in these civil systems, we talk about systems that are affecting people, not fighting for an elephant, not fighting for a donkey, not fighting for red or blue or Republican or Democrat, but trying to figure out that with this hope that we have, with this vision that we have of a God who comes to liberate and give life, to give freedom to people that are suffering under oppression, especially those of communities of faith, that in what ways can we enact and live into this vision of shalom that God has, not just for those who are economically privileged to see this happen on their behalf, but to be able to see this happen for people of all walks of life, regardless of where they're at on the economic scale, ethnically, racially, gender, of being able to see this happen for all peoples. But again, without recognizing the links in the ways Deuteronomy is making it plain that the way the community orients itself civilly, politically, communally also affects their religious life, which we'll talk about here right here next. Because from Deuteronomy 16, you have these 3 pilgrim festivals, and this will seem really random, but I'll make the connection here in a couple minutes. Just track with me here for these few minutes. You have 3 holidays, and these are going to be really important to have written down, commit them to memory, because they may show up on a quiz. 3 pilgrim festivals, and they will come up when you're taking other classes like Kings and Prophets. A couple of these will come up. These are all of them will come up in your Gospels class, because Jesus does a lot with tabernacles. Obviously, Pentecost is going to be big for Acts, and then Passover. That Jesus and his disciples celebrate a Passover meal right before Jesus goes to be crucified. But these holidays were set; these 3 holidays are set aside during their respective eras, biblical times, in order to give for people to travel to the temple in Jerusalem. And you have Passover or Pesach, which all of these have to do with, again, Deuteronomy being a very earthy book, of having to do with harvest seasons. And during Passover, you would harvest the barley, and what this is meant to commemorate, along with sacrificing of a lamb, a bunch of them, sacrificing rams, which celebrates Yahweh's deliverance from Egypt. Again, celebrating and remembering the deliverance from Egypt. You also have notes here within the Pesach meal of remembering the bitterness of slavery, remembering the bitterness of the time of the people when they were down there. So what they would usually do during the Pesach meal is eat bitter herbs and to drink salt water. Again, to literally taste and embody and reenact the bitterness both of slavery, and to remember the tears of those who had suffered under the oppression of Pharaoh. Then you have Pentecost. Shavuot celebrates the wheat, ingathering of wheat, and that's a celebration of the harvest. Then you have Tabernacles, Sukkoth. And you might see Sukkoth in your Gospels when you're reading through them. You might see Sukkoth when Sukkoth had happened, or Tabernacles, or the Festival of Lights. Those are all the same. They're repetitive. Or Feast of Booths. That's another one, because literally what they would do is that for about a week that you would live in a tent in and around Jerusalem. Again, to remember the time of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. To remember the time of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. And so again, they're reenacting the remembrance of what these feasts are meant to do in order to reinforce Israel's identity as Yahweh's covenant people. But another thing that happens in the process of these feasts or remembrances, genius move, that in order to override the syncretism after Israel enters into the land of Canaan, you have these celebrations that are tied from redemptive events into the cycle of the agricultural year, when people would be more tempted to honor Baal. And the reason why this comes up, and you'll see this happen, especially if you take a Kings and Prophets class, that you have the inclusion of Baal worship or Baal worship alongside the worship of Yahweh. And these seasonal endeavors are cyclical. Why? Because of the fact that Baal is a fertility god. And when you are in the land that needs water, you need good land, you need it for your crops, you need it for your animals in order to thrive. It makes sense that you would appease the local deity in order to make sure that your land and your cattle, your family, will survive in this specific land. And so you have the institution of these celebrations in order to help the people to navigate not only the new conditions in which they're entering into the land of Canaan, but then also to remind them about who they are. Their allegiance is to Yahweh, the God who created the heavens and the earth, not to Baal. That it's God who causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, not Baal. And so again, you have these enactions tied between ethics, what the people do, their feasts, their ingathering, they're spending time together, their worship, but then also related to their religious life, their cultic life. to serve as these reminders about who they are and who Yahweh is. And also, fun fact, that's a little figurine of Baal. And so the laws from chapters 12 to 26 are interwoven with exhortations to practice justice, to practice and embody these just practices that help Israel to reflect Yahweh's purposes for his people and for the world. And along with that, to refuse idolatrous practices. You have exhortations to practice justice and refuse idolatry. That the connection between Israel's worship and their ethics are intentionally and integrally linked, connected, interwoven in the text. That it's not by accident that these things are brought together. The justice in Israel reflects Yahweh's just, compassionate, and merciful character. Again, that to remember the Sabbath was to remember Yahweh who delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh. That everybody is allowed the possibility, the benefit, the opportunity to rest. That because Yahweh had rescued the Israelites, that the people are exhorted, encouraged, commanded even to likewise embody Yahweh's compassionate character with giving everybody a break. That again, Israel's demonstration of knowing Yahweh didn't have as much to do with recognizing a certain or obtaining a certain amount of information as much as it did embodying certain practices and habits that related itself to, okay, how do we know that they trust in the Lord? In the ways in which they live. How do they know in whose allegiance they've pledged to, Pharaoh or Yahweh? By the way an individual lived. And we'll talk about that in the end of class, especially as it relates to Matthew 25 and the king and certain stewards that we'll talk about there at the end when the king returns. But specifically for Israel and in their narratives, wherever there's idolatry, there's injustice. Wherever there's idolatry, there's going to be injustice. Wherever there's injustice, there's going to be idolatry. And I'll venture to say, make the dangerous statement, the same holds true today. The reason why children and women and men even are kidnapped and taken into sexual trafficking is because of idolatry related both to lust and to greed. Why people are paid, have to live on $2 a day around the world and have to live in inhuman conditions because, again, of idolatry related to greed in a certain way, certain lifestyle. Why communities are plagued with violence. Again, some kind of idolatry. And so, again, I bring this up not for some kind of social gospel activism. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that, but more so about trying to understand the text and then the narrative that follows from a certain kind of reading when idolatry is not just practiced, but put forth as a regular and normalized endeavor and what that leads towards. And I'll talk about that again in the second half of class. Then when we read through portions like out of Isaiah 5, you see what happens when idolatry is present. And the kind of text and what the words that Yahweh uses, the strong words that Yahweh uses to condemn those who have perpetuated and participated in injustice. So we'll talk about that. But what I want to do, we can do this. So what we're going to do, I want to do this as an exercise. What I'm going to do, we're going to have class presentations the second half of class. Don't freak out. I'll give you guys plenty of time to work on it. That what I want you guys to do, I'll assign specific readings. And this is what I had. If you guys went over to Moodle, you guys will see this. let me open this up for you guys to see. And this will be a little bit of a test because I'm going to try to make this work. All right. So what I want for you guys to do, I'm going to go ahead and get you guys into groups, and I'm going to assign you a specific section. So I'm going to say, this group, you're going to get alien foreign resident. Go to Moodle. If you click on the link, you'll see here, I'll probably have to sign in my number and all that fun stuff. So you'll have to sign in, do all that. But after that, you'll be taken to a specific article. And you'll see again. So, okay, so my group, we got alien foreign resident. We got to read section 3. Okay, so there's 1, there's 2. Okay, there's section 3. What you're going to do, read through this section. Either you can assign it as a group and divvy it up. It's a little bit long, so maybe each person takes a section. I want you to find 5. You only need 5. 5 of the most important elements from your reading, and as a group, present that to the class. So again, read through the article that you're assigned. It's only a section. You can split it up however you'd like, but present together collectively as a group. You only need to present 5 of your most important findings. Does that make sense? If not, let me go ahead and show you guys this PowerPoint. So again, read through your assigned section of an article, present 5 major findings from your reading. You just do this as a group. Not every single individual has to find 5. If you find 1 or 2, you bring them together. If you've got like 6 or 7, you can go ahead and present 6 or 7, but if you want to just boil them down to 5, feel free to do so. Create a PowerPoint or some kind of presentation for your finding, even if it's a really simple one, black and white. You just copy and pasted some things, that'll be fine. Make it really simple. You don't have to overthink it. And then for everybody who's presenting, you guys will get extra credit. So extra credit just for doing what you're supposed to do. So are there any questions, comments, or concerns? Questions, comments, or concerns? Anybody freaking out? Okay, good. Let me see. All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and send you guys into breakout rooms, and I'll go ahead and let you know what your assigned block is. Again, there's a good chunk of you that have your cameras off. And so if you have your camera off, turn it on. Let your group know that you're there. At least turn your microphone on and let people know you're there. It is expected that you guys have immediately freaked out. It is expected that you guys have some access to Moodle to be able to look at and to read through the article. And so that is also to be expected. If there are any issues, please feel free to reach out. Let me know. I'll give you guys 25 minutes to work on it. Or yeah, 20 minutes to work on it because I want you guys to take a break. 20 minutes to work on it. I'll let you guys know when we take a break. Again, keep it really simple. There's no reason to overthink it. Some of these sections are really short. But to present your most significant findings, and then we'll talk about why those from your significant findings and start to bring everything together. So we'll go ahead and talk about it in a little bit. All right. So again, we'll take 20 minutes. You guys will get to 15-minute break, and then we'll talk through it together.
He said he was gonna come. Oh, there you go.
Yep. Hey, everybody. So
alien means a position out of dependence with a certain amount of cultural isolation. Some examples of people in the Bible who were in this position. We have Abraham when he was told by God to leave his home and to go to Egypt. And we have the entire community of Israel when they were taken out of Egypt. Terms and translations. So alien is the Hebrew word ger. We have, it's also been translated to stranger, foreigner, non-Israelite, and immigrant. Its modern equivalent would be refugee. And just in terms of its common usage for people displaced by famine and war. Within the Pentateuch law, the alien was generally assumed to be a non-Israelite foreigner residing in the community. They were subject to Israelite law, including the religious law. Laws regarding aliens demonstrate a clear humanitarian concern. Yahweh stresses the protection for aliens through the examples of even-handed justice, fair wages, provision of food and harvest, and inclusion in feast and Sabbath.
I can take the slide. So although aliens were underneath the religious and the religious law and obligations of the Israelites, so they were also excluded from certain obligations and privileges, most notably that they weren't exempt from certain dietary restrictions. The aliens were actually allowed to eat meat while the Israelites were not. But on the flip side, they also weren't given some privileges, such as a resident alien could face permanent slavery, while in contrast, a native Israelite was not subject to that fate sometimes.
So relative to the identity of the patriarchs and to the character of Israel, we see this identity of the alien because they were conceived as a nation from the Exodus. They left Egypt and they had no nation. So within the Israelite society, we see aliens distinguished as non-citizens. So yeah, that's it. We added a word.
There you go. No plagiarism. Excellent work. Yeah, you guys highlighted all the hits. Everything from the recognition that Israel has an ancestor that is an alien, or what we call a migrant or a refugee. Abraham going from his homeland and just wandering around in the area. Again, Israel being out of Egypt as a kind of wandering migrant people. They themselves being these kind of resident aliens. But I don't want to go too far into it because, yeah, you guys did such great work. I'm getting pumped. All right, the second group who had alien foreign resident section 3. Section 3. Okay. Christian, Isaiah, or Vanessa?
I think I don't know about. I think I got mixed up a little bit because I thought we had to do sections 1, 2, and 3, like the whole 3 of them.
Yeah, it was section 3. Do you guys have anything from what you guys read?
I kind of focused on like section 1, which kind of like the other group kind of had already just gone over and pretty much covered everything. So
okay,
that was a bit of a mix up on my part. My apologies.
Okay, no problem. Vanessa, do you have anything for section 3, or somebody have section 3?
Yeah, I have some things for a second.
Go ahead and share.
So basically, I found out is that an alien was to be treated as a native Israelite or greater consideration. Equal treatment was under the law, was retained out of a sense of justice, equality, as well as a protection of the community. Special protection was affordable for aliens, along with orphans and widows, out of consideration for more a valuable social economic position. A resident alien was subject to Israelite law, just as a native Israelite would be. The same law must apply to the alien as a native born. Laws imposed on aliens include not only criminal laws, but also a number of religious laws as well. Aliens were even subject to religious purity laws. And with the holy codes that we find harsh standards were imposed upon aliens equally as a native. Israelites and aliens are subject to the death penalty for giving children to the Molochis from Leviticus 22. Whereas aliens and foreigners were apparently accepted from certain dare tree, such as eating the meats of animals that were found dead was acceptable for foreigners and aliens, but not to Israelites. And then finally, aliens could face permanent impairment while the Israelites were protected from that. But basically permanent slavery while the Israelites were protected from that fate.
Good. And this is important to recognize, especially again, what we had just talked about with Deuteronomy and its legislation or regulations of Sabbath, and how from top down, it doesn't matter your economic class, your socioeconomic status, that these obligations to keep Sabbath and to rest are for everybody because of some of these, again, some of these social institutions that are already in place. And so again, we're getting behind some of the text and some of the assumptions that are there. So we're going to keep peeling back some layers, especially as they exist for orphans. You guys, section 1 and 2.
Is this for the orphan part?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, orphans, section 1 and 2.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen.
Do it. All right, cool. Beautiful.
So, our presentation is gonna be on orphans, and it's the people in my group was Jasper, Kim, Joseph, Chabanu, I think. I don't want to pronounce it wrong, and then me. So yeah. And then, so some interesting facts that we read was that the protection of the widow and the orphan, as in the mother and then the orphan, it was a moral duty of the chief. And then the key socioeconomic problem for orphans is the disposition of the inheritance, talking about like when the husband dies and then the widow and then the son. So the biggest problem there was seeing if the orphans is disturbed in a way, the inheritance. And then because there were guidelines to regarding the rights of the widow upon the demise of her spouse. And it was just the main one was how she came to be his wife. So it says that the issue was a dowry with which she had entered into marriage arrangements. And then it says, and then it is just, ooh, I went back, hold on. It was the decision of if the inheritance would return to the father's home, as in the parents or siblings, or be kept by the husband, or be given to the child. And it says that the memory of the exodus is underscored in the man to treat the orphan as well as the resident alien, which we already heard about, with justice in any legal proceeding. And then it talked about how Yahweh would hear the cry to every for whatever they had done when Israel had gone under the Egyptian yoke. And then it just talks about the Exodus and then where that could be found. Another interesting thing was that the account of the complaint of the daughters of the deceased Cephalon. Okay, so one of us actually kind of read section 3. These two things will be mentioned probably in the next presentation. And then it just leads to the specification of the proper order for determining the rights of the heir of the inheritance upon the death of the father, as mentioned before. And then it says that the multiplication of the human race is part of God's design for humanity. Within the broader intention appears that with the commitment that Yahweh made to Abraham to make him into the father of the nation. So with that idea. And then the last one is that the background helps explain the extent of the losses suffered by a child at the death of the parents, especially that of the father. The context for the care of these orphans, along with the other less fortunate, such as widows and resident aliens. And then these three groups are often mentioned together in passages dealing with the care of the powerless ancient Israel.
Yes.
And then the citation.
Of course.
We
Awesome.
didn't plagiarize.
Awesome. Of course not. All right. Excellent work. Gosh, there's so much I want to say, but we have to keep moving for the sake of time. All right. The orphan section 3-4.
Yep.
Section 3-4. Do it.
Let me tell y'all about this this plagiarism. Okay, I halfway cited. We're not gonna talk about it. Okay.
You're good. You're fine. It's blessed.
Yeah. Okay. Can y'all see that?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So the first one's providing for the orphan, fundamental to the ethical call to the nation to defend and provide for the orphan is the very character of Yahweh, which was that's just lit. Good writing.
Yep.
Inclusion of the orphan. So celebrations were annual reminders of Israel's unique corporate identity in the world, and the orphan was not to be cut off from this special privilege, which is also dope. Keep going. The shifting of the orphan's plight. So in other words, personal adversity was not to be compounded by marginalization and exclusion, which is just another, this is awesome, changing the identity there. Concern for the orphan and the rest of the Old Testament. The courage of this orphan, the ironic fate of the evil Haman, and deliverance of God's people continue to be celebrated in the feast of Purim. Hopefully I said that right.
Purim.
Praise God.
There you go.
Should be one more. There it is. And then from orphan to family. The Pentateuch does not delineate the transfer of the family patrimony in the case of orphans, with the detail found in other ancient Near Eastern law codes.
Good. Whoa, back up real quick. Go to the slide before.
How do I do that?
You're good. Who's the orphan that delivers Israel from Haman?
Does it say that on there?
No, yeah, well, it's because it's in the Bible.
Oh, I was like, what?
No, you bring up a great point because this often gets overlooked.
So what's the question?
Who's the orphan that delivers Israel from Haman?
Moses?
No, think later on in the Old Testament. It's a woman.
Oh.
Esther.
I was gonna say that. I ain't gonna lie, I was scared.
No, you're good. Esther. So again, to think of this marginalized individual, not just marginalized because they're an orphan, but also they're a woman, so they're already below on the tier, ends up subverting the entire system in order to become the deliverer for Israel during a time when they are not only being oppressed by foreign nations, but then also the thought for Israel very much is God has abandoned us. And so again, there's so many layers for us to uncover, but for the sake of time, we got to keep moving. But again, the ongoing narrative of the most unlikely, regardless of where you're at on the socioeconomic scale, of not just being used by God for the purposes of liberation, but then also how God subverts the system with so many of these positions that are supposed to be powerless. And again, hopefully that theme keeps coming up over and over again. You guys are hearing how these marginalized groups they're without power, whether economic or social power. And so, great. Next section of wealth and poverty, section 3 and 4.
That's me.
Go ahead.
Oh, wait, I got it. Sorry, screen share is weird.
Yeah, you're good.
Oh. Okay, I'm gonna keep it like this. I'm sorry. Y'all are just too tech savvy for me. Y'all had like 12 presentation slides and I do not. My bad. Okay.
That button in the top right.
Oh, where am I looking?
Top right.
Oh, because we're blocking it. I get it. Oh, I feel so tech savvy. Look at me go.
Yeah.
Okay. So we did wealth and poverty.
Yeah.
Those are all my group members, Jaime and Christian. The main points were like the 3 narrative complexes. The first one was the description of creation, and that humans in the ideal world, after God created all of us, we were supposed to live in harmony with God and his creation. However, that's literally spiraled down into rebellion. Death and violence took over. With Adam and Eve eating all that, and then here we are. And then the third narrative complex goes into Exodus, comprising of course, the Exodus of Egypt, Israel's freedom and from slavery. God still cares for his people. And yeah, and then we got the patriarchal narratives and gifts. The patriarchal narratives tell the gaining of the possessions by God's people, both in the Promised Land and in Egypt. God later pledges to provide homes, good crop, fruitfulness, and vineyards in Canaan after the removal of the inhabitants. Then the second one is the marital gifts. At one level, the marital gifts from God to his people echoed his divine purpose at creation to bless humanity and were particularly displayed of the mandate to multiply and fill the earth. So yeah, that's our overview, and that's our works cited. No plagiarism here.
Excellent. Excellent. You guys laid out a good foundation for how we understand both wealth in the Old Testament and why the second half, when we talk about it, section 5 and 6, should hit home a little bit stronger. So section 5 and 6 for wealth and poverty. Section 5 and 6 for wealth and poverty.
Okay, that's me. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me see. Okay, looks like it's not working, so I'm just going to read it off if that's okay.
Do it.
Okay, let me pull this up. Okay, so in this section, it kind of talks about, like, it has an overview of how, like, God is all about heart posture, like with our wealth, and how to serve the poor. So I wrote down some quotes that kind of stuck out to me in the reading. So it said that poverty was not an uncommon experience in ancient times. Diseases, wars, market fluctuations, and agricultural disasters such as crop failure and drought and insect plagues would have contributed to the ruin of family, village, city, or country. So basically, it kind of talks about how God wanted, like, the leaders to be mindful of people who were stuck in poverty, but it also said in the reading that they weren't, like, gonna perish because they were still able to offer sacrifices to God in the midst of their poverty. Sorry, I'm on my sister's computer. It's like hard to see. So it says that with the possession of riches, they should also be accompanied by wisdom and integrity. Which I think is like a common theme, like in the Old Testament. Like, God's not like, he's not all about like how much wealth you have, but it's more about like, well, are you wealthy like with wisdom and integrity? And that's what I have.
Excellent. 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 All right. So we'll go ahead, finish out with widow, section 1 to 3.
All right, I guess that's our group. So let me see if we can share, or Aaron, do you want to share your screen? That might be easier. Let me see.
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
Okay. And I think we're all just going to share. We did like 3 slides, so we're each going to do a slide, if that's fine.
Do it.
Okay, cool. So the first part, we kind of grouped it in the 3 different sections. So the first grouping, it kind of talked about how it was really uncommon to have widows it was really common to have widows in that time because there were lots of different diseases. So people passing away, also war with the male population, and then the difference of ages between the men and women getting married were often like a decade or more. So the men dying sooner was pretty common. The monarchs also had some sort of like responsibility towards the widows. I didn't really understand that one a whole lot, but that was like a big key thing for that. And then the financial future of the widow also depended on retrieving the dowry support by the father's house. And there were like, it could also depend on the husband if he left anything. And but there was like contingent. So like if she got remarried, then it was possible to be taken away. And then there was also like the leave right marriages and stuff like that. So then Aaron.
So widows within the Pentateuch, the first point that stood out was women were still viewed in high regard because of their role in childbearing, the administration of the home, and the education of children. So even though they were still widows and they were still like viewed really highly, which was great to see. The two acts of community, there was two acts of community charities for the widows. One was reapers left some harvest, and every third year they would collect a tithe for the needy.
Mhm.
So that's what took out in that section.
Yeah.
And so the concern for widows in the rest of the Old Testament, which is the last section of widows. So beyond the Pentateuch, Yahweh remained the protector of widows, and it was a moral virtue to take care of the widows, and injustice towards them were strongly condemned by the prophets. And in the ancient Near East, the ideal was that the kings of Israel established justice to care for the weak, including the widows.
There you go. There you go. You guys nailed it. Nailed it. I was thinking about just giving 10. Maybe I'll give 20 for this one. It's almost like a whole, it'll be like a side, like 2 assignments worth. But excellent work, everybody. You guys captured so much of the guts of we were trying to get at with presenting. And hopefully you guys heard over and over and over again, not just the socioeconomic concern for those who are economically disadvantaged, but ultimately how it's not only the concern for Yahweh, but that concern extends itself to the community about how they go about treating not just those who are marginalized, but their neighbors. One of the things that will get brought up, we will talk about this in a little bit, and address it right now, is that the way Israel orients themselves towards their neighbors is not as just those people down the street, but rather when your brothers and sisters become poor, when your brothers and sisters are in need, that the orientation for Israel is not just as a general people, but as a family. And again, that's really important for us to recognize, especially when we talk about ethics and we talk about how we are orient ourselves as a community, because we're not just helping out regular people, but we're helping out brothers and sisters, especially as it pertains to the community of faith. And so I want to be able to take everything, all the brilliance of what you guys presented, and to be able to make sense of, okay, well, what does this have to do with this text? And what are some of the theological significant points that we can draw out from what's been talked about and what's presented already? First, I want to be able to read from this passage and then elaborate on some of what you guys have already presented. So there will be, in Deuteronomy 15, there will, however, be no one in need among you, because the Lord is sure to bless you in the land that the Lord your God has given you as a possession to occupy, if you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing this entire commandment that I command you today. When the Lord your God has blessed you as he promised you, you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community in your own towns within the land the Lord your God has given you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. The translators did some of the hard work for us in translating literally in Hebrew some of the intentions of what that means for us in English. So what it means is greedy. So don't become hard-hearted or tight-fisted, get greedy towards your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be. Be careful that you do not entertain a mean thought, thinking the 7th year, the year of remission, is near. And therefore, view your needy neighbor with hostility and give nothing. Your neighbor might cry to the Lord your God, the Lord against you, and you would incur guilt. Give liberally and ungrudgingly when you do so, for on this account, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and all you undertake, since there will never cease to be some in need. There will never cease to be poor in the land on the earth. Therefore, I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy, the neighbor in your land. So there's a couple things I want to bring up. So why immigrants, widows, orphan, and the poor? It's because these groups form the most vulnerable in Israel's society. And as you guys saw and as you guys read, that these people not only were easy to take advantage of, they were left without a lot of social clout, a kind of economic safety net by which to fall back on when things got difficult, which, as you guys read, was very common during this ancient time. If your crops did not yield what it was supposed to yield, you're on the verge of poverty. If your husband or was killed in war, died in a famine, picked up a disease, and you were left to be a widow, again, very common without modern medicine. When your parents died for whatever reason, again, very common for that to happen. When you had to leave your own nation because either war or famine had hit, you are now put into the category of being a very vulnerable person. But again, the social safety net that Yahweh provides for those that are most vulnerable is expressed for Israel, not just to take as really good advice, not just to take as those that are concerned about these social endeavors, but rather key to the way Israel exhibits their faith, their loyalty to Yahweh, is this expression of concern for those who are most vulnerable. Why? Because Yahweh had shown a kind of demonstration of care or concern when Israel was most vulnerable in the land of Egypt. And so again, for Israel to be not just committed to Yahweh, but to express their devotion was to take upon the character of Yahweh, not ambiguously, not abstractly, as in just being a general good person, paying the taxes every once in a while, but rather in the way that they treat their neighbor. But who specifically their neighbor? The most vulnerable. So Yahweh's concern for the marginalized lends itself to Israel's ethic to care for those who are most marginalized. Again, these concerns are not just a matter of religious spirituality, though it's deeply spiritual, it's also deeply tangible what they do with their everyday stuff. Like, what do they do with the edges of their fields? Because again, the concern for poverty, which often tears at societies, which we see especially in countries in Africa, we see it in Central and Latin America, we see it within Asian countries, where there's rampant poverty. There's also rampant violence. There's also rampant sex trafficking, prostitution. That poverty serves as some of the greatest threat, if not the greatest threat, to the welfare of any and every nation, country, tribe, wherever it might be found. That here in Deuteronomy, especially in chapter 16, that you have this premise, which I need to revisit over here, that there will, however, be no need among you, if there's anyone in need, since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth. And so that should take us back a little bit, the fact that there's not going to be any need among those who are counted amongst God's people, but there will always be some in need upon the earth. And this kind of contrast demonstrates the reality between ideal and reality. That the ideal vision is that the community would function in such a generous way that would meet the needs of the most vulnerable among them. And part of this is what we find in Acts 2, of when we have people who are selling their properties and giving to anyone who has need. Again, it's not a socialist enterprise as much as it is living into this vision of Yahweh's original intention, that that which has been entrusted to the people is given to them to be stewarded in order to meet the needs of those who are most economically vulnerable. That you have possessions being sold in order to ensure that somebody wouldn't have to sell themselves into slavery, that somebody wouldn't have to sell themselves into prostitution, but rather the community is able to economically care for itself because of the motivations of generosity, which are commended here in Deuteronomy and lived out, especially over in Acts. That these people are so compelled by this vision of Jesus that they lend themselves towards being a generous kind of people that refuse to put property over people.
I have a quick question. Is there something that ties with like people like trying to earn something from God by doing these acts of kindness?
You mean like I'm gonna give this person $100 in order for God to give me 500?
I guess something like that. Like I guess like so I think some or it was Olivia mentioned something about the posture of the heart and stuff like that. But I feel like I don't know. I just thought that I would mention that and just see if there's anything you would add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, Proverbs goes on to say, he, and I'll include she, who lends to the poor, lends to the Lord, and their reward will not be withheld. Something to that regard. The second half, I believe that either the Lord repays like sevenfold or tenfold, or the Lord will not withhold repaying. But that there's this intricate connection that in caring for the poor, this demonstration of loyalty or caring, there's a care being demonstrated to not just to Yahweh, but about the things Yahweh is concerned about, which again, here, the express concern are those that are most economically vulnerable, economically and socially vulnerable. Again, over and over, we hear that they have these people who have no real standing within society, and how Yahweh is expressly concerned about those people. There, at this point, there's no, it's not necessarily tit for tat as much as it is like, hey, you give $50 to the poor, Yahweh's going to give you $100. You give somebody $2, Yahweh's going to give you $10. There's not necessarily so much the kind of investment opportunity that the poor become as much as it is that Yahweh rewards or blesses obedience in the context of covenant. And I think, again, coming from heartfelt obedience, heartfelt motivations, that this demonstration of loyalty that a person wants to show is a part of the way this demonstration of love or loyalty, that in having to pick, do I love God? Do I love my neighbor? Which one's first? Which one's priority? It's in loving a neighbor, loving the vulnerable, that this love for God is demonstrated. And that the demonstration about love for God is demonstrated through this love, this commitment, this loyalty that's demonstrated, and care that's demonstrated for those that are most economically and socially vulnerable. So there's no, I don't say, there's no kind of like economic arrangement about like being motivated by how much interest can accrue by on the yearly percentage APR, those kinds of things. Like you get 10% back for every $10 you give to somebody who's economically disadvantaged. So yeah, there's no flight points given for those kinds of things, but yeah, there does seem to be a reward for obedience, and Jesus goes on to say as much. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, but the reality is that while this seems, hopefully this seems pretty plain to us about how our call as God's people, that it's biblically faithful to care about the most economically disadvantaged, including migrants, including widows, including the poor, and including orphans. And James will go on to, in chapter 1 and chapter 2, we'll talk about that pure religion, pure and undefiled religion is to care for widows and orphans. And you can see why. Because they are ones without inheritance. They are ones who are left out of homes and apart from families. But the reality, especially in Israel's history, as you'll come to find out when you guys take Kings and Prophets, is that injustice in Israel is especially prevalent when they settle into the land. There's something to comfort. There is something to comfortability that lends itself to a kind of lackadaisical attitude in terms of what people care about when it comes to those that are most marginalized. That with comfort comes a kind of complacency, and with that comes idolatry. That as Israel grows economically and politically powerful as they settle into the land, so we will see idolatry become more and more and more prevalent. That's the reason why they get sent into exile. And so I don't want to scare the bejesus out of anybody, but let me go ahead. I was reading this last night and I was like, geez, we need to read through this. I want for us to pay attention to the language that the Yahweh through Isaiah is communicating about what's happening here. Again, Israel is in the land. They're doing well. They've got the temple in Jerusalem. They're offering their sacrifices. The religious systems, the sacrificial systems working out for them. But yet there still exists both idolatry and injustice. Idolatry and injustice are still in existence. And so in reading this from Isaiah, that all you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there's room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. So again, the accumulation about those who are economically well off to get more and more and more and more for themselves while not leaving any room for the poor. That the Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. What does that mean? Is that they're going to try to gather a bunch of stuff, but that's not going to amount to very much. All you who rise early in the morning in pursuit of strong drink, who linger in the evening but to be inflamed by wine, whose feasts consist of lyre and harp, tambourine and flute, but who do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. Therefore, my people go into exile without knowledge. Their nobles are dying of hunger, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore, Sheol has enlarged its appetite. This is the place of the dead. This isn't hell. That's Gehenna, but this is the place of the dead. Has enlarged its appetite and opens its mouth beyond measure. The nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude go down, her throng and all who exult in her. People are brought down and everyone is brought low, but the eyes of the haughty are humbled. But the Lord of hosts is exalted by justice, and the holy God shows himself holy by righteousness. And again, this has more to do with the keeping or maintenance of faithfulness, covenant commitment here. Then the lambs shall graze in their pasture, fatlings and kids shall feed among the ruins. So this is kind of a picture of Eden in the midst of chaos. Ah, you who drag iniquity along with the course of falsehood, who drag sin as with cart ropes, who say, let him make haste, let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the plan of the Holy One of Israel hasten to fulfillment that we may know it. Ah, you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. All you who are wise in your own eyes and shrewd in your own sight, all you who are heroes in drinking wine, valiant in mixing drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of their rights. Again, the injustice that is prevalent in Israel is not something that they ever really get away from. But I would say, in fact, goes on to be worse as Israel settles into the land. That again, the reality of injustice and idolatry only gets worse for Israel. As they're living in God's promises, they're in the land of milk and honey, living Yahweh's good plan. But yet the possibility for rebellion still exists, which happens rampantly. And the obligations towards faithful obedience and loyalty, the manifestation of that being exhibited, not just in what they do in their religious life, but how they go about treating their neighbors, especially the most vulnerable. That doesn't happen. Wherever there's idolatry, injustice is sure to follow. Wherever there's injustice, idolatry is nearby. So idolatry and injustice, they're together. And likewise, for us to see actual justice lived out that lasts a lot longer than what we're seeing in our inflamed circumstances, we have to think, in what ways are we being formed into certain kinds of individuals that are able to rightly not just pursue justice, but to see it flourish for everybody from every walk of life. that we can't just pursue justice for justice sake, but to pursue justice as a part of the way God has committed himself to humanity to bring about a shalom, a wholeness, a healing, a peace upon the earth that gets us back to Eden, towards a place that looks closer like home. More so than it is about recompensatory and sometimes brutal justice. And it's painful, 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 because it takes time and hard work and will often leave us on the margins because of faith. But again, it's part of how we go about living out this faithful obedience as a part of this vision of what God's given us. And so I did mention, I'm going to talk about the land here. That there's this bit in Deuteronomy that when you've come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it and settle in it. That the land is depicted in Deuteronomy across the whole Pentateuch, but specifically here in Deuteronomy. It's an inheritance from Yahweh that must be stewarded. It's an inheritance from Yahweh that must be stewarded. That just because it's a gift doesn't mean it doesn't come without a responsibility. And likewise, the same with community. Because of the community of people around you as a gift doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to care for them as well. These gifts come with a responsibility. So stewarding the land, what does it mean? Participating faithfully in Israel's cultic and religious life, including, again, the reaping of crops, whenever the time came to celebrate, and then also being generous with what the land produced. That those who owned land were instructed to not pick the crops all the way to the end, but to leave the edges of their crops for those who were economically disadvantaged, for the poor, for widows, for orphans. And in that way, again, extending generosity. That they didn't take everything because it belonged to them, but rather because something belonged to them, they chose to share it. And so landowning was a matter of worship and ethics. That what an individual did with their land demonstrated or reflected loyalty to Yahweh or not. Again, which is why I read that bit in Isaiah. The point isn't to accumulate more and more and more for the sake of just compounding one's assets and properties, but rather being generous with what Yahweh has given us to steward. And this isn't to guilt trip, I need to say something else. This isn't to guilt trip anybody who is economically well off, your family's well off, your parents are well off, you find yourself in a comfortable economic situation. As much as it pertains to the responsibilities we have, whether we're making $1 million a year or $100 a year, that how we go about stewarding the resources that God has entrusted to us as his people, that what we do with what's been entrusted to us reflects our loyalty to Yahweh, and I'll say at this point reflects our loyalty to Jesus, whether we choose to be greedy or generous. You don't have to be rich to be greedy. And likewise, you don't have to be rich to be generous. And so I'll leave you guys with this. Now, what does justice look like today? I'm not going to read through this passage for the sake of time, but you have this story in Matthew 25 about a king who returns from a trip, and upon coming back, that you have these servants who come back and greet this king, and at the return of the king, that you have these two groups of people, of those who take care of those who are hungry, who are thirsty, who are naked, and are commended. And Jesus goes so far to say, and you guys will, most of you will be familiar with the passage, whatsoever you did for the least of these, you've done unto me. And those other group of people who said, well, when did we see you? We didn't know you had come by. And at the bypassing of those who hungered and thirsted, who were naked, who were in jail, that Jesus commits them to judgment. And that these two images about how generosity is expressed with the most vulnerable, that we're not saved by works. That's the first thing. You don't go in, you don't get to enter into the kingdom because you do a whole bunch of things for people. But rather there's a recognition about who our allegiance is pledged through obedient generosity. And that in caring for the marginalized, we care for Jesus. And that it's important to recognize that King Jesus, creator of heaven and earth, identifies himself not with the religious elite, not with the politically powerful, but those who are amongst the most vulnerable in communities, the naked, the hungry, the poor, those who are in prison. That's who Jesus identifies himself with. When you've taken care of the least of these, you've taken care of me. Water to drink, food to eat, clothes on the back. How does Jesus care for others? You guys. Us. And that as followers of Jesus, we're always stewards. We're always stewards, never owners or masters. That those things which have been entrusted to us, your education, your experience, your job, your money, your relationships, your family, everything of what's been entrusted to you, both now and in the future, however much or however little you have, has been entrusted to you to not to own, not to use as mastery over other people, but to use as a steward for the benefit of all peoples that you have been put into contact with for the good of Jesus and his kingdom. And that in us living as faithful and obedient people, that's how we live out this vocation to be God's people, to be that original intention, the real image of God, to be reflections of God within the world, which again, Genesis 1, God putting these humans in the garden to be reflections of himself in the earth doesn't happen apart from obedience. And that we're always stewards of our relationship with Jesus, stewards of our relationships with others, stewards with what we've been entrusted with, both materially, spiritually, physically, emotionally, whatever you've been entrusted with, and stewards of the earth. And so when we start to think we have mastery and that we're called to have supremacy and lordship over things, that's when we run into trouble and become more like Pharaoh and less like Yahweh. That's what Deuteronomy is trying to warn us against. That in participating in acts of compassion and kindness, like that's how we live into this original intention and vision of becoming who God has created us to be, which is reflections of himself in the earth. And so that's why we have the Holy Spirit with us. That's why you've been called, brought into this family. And the plans that God has for you are for those purposes of seeing the world, every person reconciled, brought into God's family, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity. Of seeing this massive family brought together in the end. So, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Been working on it all weekend. Just kidding. I don't know where this stuff comes from. The Holy Spirit. Yeah, it's also part of the thing that, I mean, this is part of my, you call a soapbox, the thing that I'm passionate about. Because dude, my grandpa was an immigrant. Came over here broke, worked 3 jobs at a time. I don't say 4, but 3 jobs at a time, driving trucks, waiting tables. My grandma was at home. She worked in a factory every now and then, but it's part of the story that comprises who I am now. And I know for a lot of you, that's your stories too. Your family came from a different country, or your family moved around a lot, and you worked really, really hard. And my question was always, and still continues to be, is where was the church, and where does the church continue to be? Where are God's people continuing to be when the opportunity presents itself to be this alternative community that can engage socioeconomically for the welfare of all peoples, not just for those that have the same interests as us? We're really working for the welfare and the benefit of the most vulnerable. And mind you, that was a huge part of the Christian community in the first few centuries. They were comprised of a lot of slaves and poor people. They didn't have any celebrities. Largely persecuted. Their leader died butt naked on a cross, resurrected 3 days later, so they got that going for them. But largely the community is comprised. They have some well-off benefactors like Theophilus and Luke, but majority of the community is poor. And so there's something to be said about the power of the gospel for those that are without socioeconomic power, and the power of God that's still on display, especially against when it seems like the cards are stacked against us. Now we still get up, still keep moving forward. It sucks, it's hard, it's difficult. A lot of times just want to give up, but that's the gospel. God's with us, and so is his kingdom. The kingdom's here right now. That even in places where it looks like God isn't, that's where he's at. It was the same in Deuteronomy. It's the same with Jesus on a cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? But he's right there, right in the middle of it. All right, well, you guys have no questions, comments, concerns? Sorry, I kept you guys 10 minutes over. Church went long today. If you guys have any questions, again, let me know this week as you guys are working on your study guides. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. But yeah, you guys have an absolutely beautiful week, Tuesday, Thursday, 2 to 4 o'clock if you guys can make it. If not, see you guys next week.